So I have a pretty good story to tell. I was about 9 years old, so this was probably 1996 or so, playing in my family's huge front yard. We lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city limits. A man drove up and pulled his car over on the side of the road. He stepped out and began to greet me. The man told me he was lost and asked me how to get to a specific city over an hour away. I knew the name of said city, but obviously I didn't know how to actually get there. I pointed over in the direction of the highway and said I thought that might be the right way. I vaguely remember, though, telling him I didn't know and that he should really ask an adult instead. To this, the man started making comments such as, "Oh, I'm sure you can help me. You look like a real smart girl." The man pulled out a map and set it down on the hood of his car. He asked me if I could at least come over and show him on this map where the specific city was. As a child, it didn't even dawn on me that the stranger had this map and so should be able to find the city himself. I kept on trying to tell him I didn't know how to get to the area he was asking about. He kept on telling me I looked so smart and emphasizing how lost he was and that he needed my help specifically. Because somebody was mowing their lawn nearby, it was hard to hear the man as well. He used that as an excuse to say he couldn't hear me and asked me to come closer. I didn't make any attempt to do so, but he did start to approach me. My parents had planted hedges around our yard, but at the time, those shrubs were pretty short. At this point, the man had moved from the front of his car and started crossing the hedge line, asking me to come ever closer so he could hear me. Now, here's the part I wasn't aware of, and my mom filled me in on when I was older. She and my dad were inside our house. We have a bunch of windows facing the front yard, but also a bunch of trees between the house and the yard, so my parents couldn't necessarily see me. My mom said our dog Annie, a 3-year-old German Shepherd Golden Retriever mix, was suddenly going absolutely apeshit. Annie was barking non-stop while running from the door and windows to my parents over and over again. My parents happened to be in the middle of something and just thought Annie probably had to pee. My mom went to let Annie outside. She said the moment she opened that door, Annie flew off the porch. She swears Annie was hauling ass so fast, the dog didn't even touch the porch at all. Now, back to the scene between me and the stranger. He was now only about 12 feet away from me. I was just standing there, stressed out, confused, and not knowing what to do. Suddenly, Annie came shooting across the yard and jumped right in front of me. Annie was the sweetest dog, and we'd had her ever since she was a puppy. She was the runt of her litter, but still a good-sized gal considering her mix of breeds. Now here she was. She was baring her teeth, snarling and snapping towards this strange man. I remember looking at her and trying to get her to calm down. Still, this was not enough to stop the strange man's approach. He took a step forward into the yard. Annie seemed to be fully aware that this man had evil intentions, though, because she refused to back down. In fact, she kept me behind her and kept backing up, pushing me back. She was not going to let that man get any further. The man still cautiously tried to take a couple more steps. Around this time, my parents peeked out the window, looking to see where Annie had gone. Of course, they saw the whole scene happening out in the yard and began to freak out. They ran out the door screaming. I remember being so confused with everything going on. The man, the neighbor's loud mower, Annie going crazy, my parents running and screaming. When the strange man saw my parents coming, he ran back to his car and gunned it down the street. I even vaguely remember seeing the stranger's map flying off in the air as my dad threw me over his shoulder and ran back towards the house. This happened in 1989. I had given birth to my son early in the morning the day before. I'd lost a fair bit of blood, but had been up walking at least once by then, so I wasn't too dopey. My son was sleeping in his bassinet next to my bed. A nurse I'd never seen before came into my room, grabbed hold of one end of the bassinet, and started to pull it away. I grabbed the other end as fast as I could. "Hey, what are you doing?" She said she was taking him away for his blood tests. Now, I happen to be a registered nurse myself, and I already knew what sorts of things had to be done with newborns. My son had already had his tests. I pointed to the band-aid on his heel and told her, "He's already had all his tests. What sort of tests are you talking about?" She quickly muttered something about not being sure, but there was some test he still needed. I maintained my firm grip on the bassinet and told her to find out right now and let me know. The woman fled and never came back. Honestly, I was so out of it though that I never even thought to mention it to anyone. The fact is, several babies have been taken that summer by imposters dressed in uniform, so I'll never know for sure, but I feel like I really dodged a bullet that day. So, this is not a story that I would normally share, as it still makes my skin crawl to this day. Here goes all the same. My mom used to be a nanny for a very wealthy family back when I was a kid. The parents of the kids preferred my mom watch the children at their home, and compromised in allowing her to bring me with her to work since she had no one to take care of me. During the years, my mom acquainted herself with their housekeeper, but always kept a distance because something about that lady seemed a little bit off. My mom is so nice though, and she's the type of person to give everyone a chance. As the years started to go by, this housekeeper lady constantly began to tell my mom that I was such a beautiful young girl, so smart, blah blah blah. She then began to mention her son more frequently, in which case my mom would always change the subject. We had an idea of where she was trying to steer the conversation, but the woman was relentless. This lady would always say how her son loved to write and draw and how handsome he was, but she would never share much more than that. To be frank, we couldn't care less. Mind you, I was only 13 at the time anyway. My mom asked her very bluntly one day, after becoming uncomfortable with the constant flaunting of her son, "Why do you keep mentioning your son around my daughter? Are you trying to set them up or something? She's too young for a relationship if that's the case." The housekeeper lady became defensive immediately and said something along the lines that she had the right to talk about her son whenever she wanted to and was allowed to brag about his amazing talents. I guess that's true. My mom and I digressed and thought maybe we were just overreacting. We just tried not to let it bother us again. Fast forward 2 months though, to when the scariest and craziest thing happened. It was a weekend around 8 or 9 p.m. I remember being at my dad's house because I spent weekends with him and my half-siblings. Out of nowhere, my mom called up my dad sobbing and terrified and told him to make sure I didn't leave his sight, be on high alert. She said she had already called the cops because a random man had come knocking on the door asking for me specifically. The man was no younger than 30 years old. She expressed how angry she was at first, thinking I had been talking to this man behind her back or something. When she asked him who he was though, his immediate response was, "Oh, it's me, the housekeeper lady's son. Your daughter and I have been talking. She gave my mom her number so we could text. We're supposed to be catching a movie and dinner tonight." My mom knew immediately he was lying his ass off and began screaming for him to leave. She knew very well I'd never talked to this guy in my entire life, let alone agreed to go out with him. He continued to harass my mom and became irate, insisting we had a date planned for that night. Luckily, my older brothers were visiting with my mom and called the cops and then confronted him. It almost led to a physical altercation. The guy fled to his car and got away before the cops could arrive. Coincidentally, after that day, the housekeeper lady never showed up again at my mom's job either. The only explanation we have as to how she could have found my mom's home is that she must have followed her after work or something. My mom had never shared that information with anyone. Fast forward again to less than a year from that incident. My mom had a day where she was completely shaken, like something I'd never seen before. Turns out the lady's son was 37 years old. He got caught violently attacking an 11-year-old little girl from our community and was sentenced to 28 years in prison. This guy had an ugly record and was clearly on the hunt for someone young and vulnerable. His evil mother enabled this behavior. Although my mom did report the creep's mom to the cops as well, the night her son came looking for me, we have no idea what became of that lady. I just wish the guy would have been caught before ever being allowed to lay hands on a poor innocent girl. I can't help but think that he would have most likely done that to me as well, had the circumstances allowed. This story is not super creepy initially, and at the time it happened, I wasn't all that concerned about it either. Years later, though, I do find it a lot more concerning. This happened when I was 16 years old. One night, when my parents were out, my brother had one of his friends staying over. Let's call him Jay. I sorta knew this guy. He was a couple of years older than me, and seemed to be nice enough. I briefly talked to Jay when I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, then returned to my bedroom, where I laid down on the bed watching a film on my laptop. The lights were off and I had my headphones in. I wasn't really paying attention to my broader surroundings. For some inexplicable reason, though, I felt the sudden need to look up from the screen, where I noticed a shape lying on the floor. I don't know why this didn't freak me out. I was kind of tired and not really thinking straight, I guess. So I simply switched the light switch next to me, where I spotted my brother's mate just laying on the floor grinning at me. I felt a little bit uncomfortable, mainly because I was wearing very short shorts and he had a perfect view into them. His eyes wandered all over my body. I just stared at him and said something like, "I think you're in the wrong room." He was grinning at me still and said he'd only popped in to say hi. Maybe I felt a tad flattered to get this kind of attention from an older guy back then. I don't really remember. He was fairly easy on the eye, to put it bluntly, so I shrugged the whole thing off. I ended up chatting with him for about 10 minutes until my brother came in, looking pissed off and telling his friend to get out now. The next morning, I bumped into Jay again as I got something out of the fridge. He appeared out of nowhere, standing right behind me, grabbing and smelling my hair. At this point, I was a little weirded out. He was obviously trying to flirt with me. The guy had a girlfriend, and I didn't know how to flirt at that age anyway. From that moment on, I started getting weird prank calls. Somebody would always call the landline asking for me specifically. Whenever I would say, "Hello, who's there?" there would only be heavy breathing. That was until one night when the voice actually responded, "I want to fuck your brains out." Maybe the guy didn't realize it, but I recognized his voice immediately and hung up the phone. It was Jay. I'm 100% sure of it. I was too embarrassed to tell my brother about it though, thinking he would not believe me. The prank call stopped after a couple of months, and my brother finished school, moving to another city and losing touch with Jay. I casually asked my brother about Jay recently. He told me the friendship fizzled out because Jay was always acting like such a perv. He was then accused of rape by a 14-year-old girl from their school, at which point my brother decided he was a lost cause. I think I was too naive to recognize a predator back then, but I sure do now. Here's a little context. For the past 2 months or so, I've been experiencing people attempting to get into my home, I guess. Now, I wouldn't say they've tried to really force it, but if it's not the doorknob being messed with in the night, I'm randomly hearing the back porch door slamming. I never notified the police, mainly because it didn't happen so regularly, and I thought that maybe it would be a waste of time, seeing how there was never much to go off of, other than me just hearing what sounded like these attempts. Last night's encounter, though, might just be the nail in the coffin, as I'm genuinely creeped out by it this time. So here goes. It must have been around 11:30 p.m. or so. I was laying in bed, enjoying another night after a hard day of work. I was watching some TV and trying to relax, and that's when I began to hear a slight tapping coming from my brother's window. Generally, this made me a bit tense, since most of the time they do this sort of thing earlier in the night. This time though, the noises started later than they ever had before, and they'd never done it by tapping on the windows before. I stayed quiet and tried to listen closer. Not even 5 minutes later, I began to hear the sound again. This time though, it was coming from my room. A short time passed by when I heard a sudden knock coming from the front door. I continued to stay silent, hoping whoever this was would just leave. That's when I heard them start messing with the doorknob like usual. A few attempts were made, then everything went silent once again. That is until, for lack of a better term, multiple people started harmonizing with each other outside my home. This is when I decided to pull out my phone and record. After that, I guess they decided to leave. I didn't have the guts exactly to check and try and interact with them. All I know is that things are getting much freakier than I could ever imagine, and I don't even know where to begin as to how to get rid of these people. When I was 5, my family attended a church with 2 stories. Downstairs were the nursery and Sunday school rooms. Upstairs was the main church room, where the service was held, as well as some offices, a kitchen, and a library. The main doors opened onto a stairway, connecting the 2 levels. After Sunday school, kids would either continue playing downstairs until their parents came to get them, or if they were old enough and impatient to go home like me, could go find their parents upstairs and try to convince them to stop talking and leave. My mom would spend what felt like hours talking to people after the service, so sometimes I'd go up and down the stairs a couple of times. Up to ask if we could leave, back down to play when she said not yet, repeat again maybe 10 minutes or so later. One Sunday, during one of my trips up the stairs, I noticed an elderly couple standing just outside the glass doors, smiling and waving at me. I remember thinking maybe they'd been locked out somehow and wanted to come in. That was a silly thing to think, I guess, since the doors were never locked during the hours the church was open. Wanting to be helpful, I went and opened the door and told them they could come in. Turns out, they didn't want to come in at all. Instead, they told me they were my grandparents, there to pick me up apparently. That really confused me. I was familiar with both sets of grandparents, and these people were not either of them. I told them no, they weren't my grandparents. At that point, I was thinking they just had me confused for another kid, and said so. They immediately changed their story, saying they meant they were my great-grandparents, and we hadn't met since I was a baby, so surely I wouldn't remember them. My parents had asked them to drive me home since they were busy. Even if I hadn't been smart enough to realize they could just come in if they wanted, this at least seemed very odd to me. Even as they protested that it wasn't necessary, I told them I was going to inform my parents and ran up the stairs. My mom was still talking to a group of other churchgoers, but after literally tugging on her sleeve for at least a minute, I was able to finally get her attention and announce loudly that my great-grandparents were there to pick me up, and I was supposed to go with them. My mom, of course, looked confused, then concerned. She told me my great-parents couldn't be there to pick me up, since they were all dead. That pretty quickly put a stop to the discussion about raising money for a stained glass window or whatever. My mom and some other adults went with me, back to that door, but the couple was no longer there. Since I couldn't really describe them any better than old, white hair, looking friendly, but surely not my grandparents, it was just sort of uneasily put down to them mistaking me for someone else. From then on, despite my impatience to leave, I stayed downstairs with the others until my parents came and got me. I remember being very concerned about this for quite a while, but my mom would always discourage discussing it, saying they surely just made a mistake. It's possible that's all it was, but I always remembered that it felt so wrong, how insistent they were that I leave with them right there and then. This happened around 3 years ago, and I still get goosebumps whenever I even think about it. It was about 9 o'clock or so, I believe. I had just gotten home from a hard day of work and was settling in when my doorbell rang. I sighed and went to look through the peephole of the door, only to see a random woman I'd never met before, in her late 30s. She was just standing there. I thought, oh great, this must be some religious solicitation door-to-door salesman thing like that. I was not in the mood for sure. Yes, I said as I opened the door a tiny crack. Excuse me, but is this Mr. Kimura's house? She asked very politely. Yeah, that's my name. It says so on the post box, so anyone could have read it in the lobby. I was still a bit surprised, though, to find someone looking for me. I was tired and couldn't really be bothered to deal with her, so I replied, No, sorry. No Mr. Kimura's here, I'm afraid. You have the wrong place. I began to close the door, but before I could shut it all the way, she looked me dead in the eyes. It's you, isn't it? Don't try to hide from me, Mr. Kimura. She screeched out the last part as she pushed against the door as hard as she could. I was in shock as she forced the door open and now stepped inside my apartment. I was in total panic mode. I remember I just kept saying no over and over again. I began to regain some composure, and I attempted to push her back towards the door. Get off me! I know it's you, Mr. Kimura. I found you, she called out. It was getting more and more escalated. I didn't know exactly what the hell was going on here. I had no idea what to do. I shouted that if she didn't get out right now, I was going to call the police. The woman went silent and glared at me with a puzzled look on her face. Just as suddenly as she'd forced her way in, she simply turned and left my apartment without any further drama. I double-checked to make sure the door was locked and the chain was on after. After much stressing out and worrying, I eventually went to bed. As you might have guessed, I couldn't sleep much that night. The next day, on my way home, I saw a younger woman waiting in an alley in a kind of blind spot. She looked to be a high school student. In fact, she looked a bit like the woman from last night. I guessed it might have been her daughter. I thought for a second, surely not. I must be getting paranoid. That was until she noticed me and started running right towards me. She began shouting. She had something in her hand as well. As I looked closer, I noticed it was a small knife. She was shouting and running at me with a knife in her hand. It was horrifying. Thankfully, I was not too far away from my apartment. I managed to run in and lock the door behind me. The girl began to sing through the door. "Mr. Kimura, come outside. Come outside, Mr. Kimura. If you don't come out, I'll kill you." I frantically dialed the police on my phone. As it was ringing, I dashed around my apartment, checking to make sure my windows were locked and the curtains were closed. I flipped the lights off as well. The police answered, and I explained the situation in a panicked voice. They tried their best to calm me down and said they were sending someone immediately. They would be there in less than 2 minutes. They told me to make sure the doors were locked. I went to the window to peek outside. I could see the daughter trying to climb the wall to get to my window. I also noticed the mother standing outside smiling and staring in at me. She started looking around the garden for something. That's the last thing I saw before I closed the curtains. My guess is she was looking for something to smash in my window, because suddenly something started banging against it. There was a banging from upstairs as well. I guess the girl had managed to reach the window up there. She was screeching, "I just want to meet you." I was cowering in my bathroom, frantically searching for anything to defend myself. All that was available was my toilet brush. I gripped the handle tightly, with my back against the wall, shivering in fear. After about 5 minutes, I heard a new voice. "What are you doing?" It was a male voice. Could it be the police officer? It certainly sounded like a police officer. I heard my doorbell ringing. "Mr. Kimura, this is the police. Are you okay?" I felt an awesome sense of relief wash over me. I went with the cop to the police station. I wanted to find out why these people were doing this to me. I wanted an explanation. The police confirmed that the women were under arrest. It transpired that she had committed the exact same crimes against another Mr. Kimura. I was informed her daughter was going to be placed in the care of another family member. I don't know exactly which Mr. Kimura they were looking for, or what exactly he did to them to make them act like this. I had never seen either of the women before. It worries me to think that one day they might try to come back. I've considered even changing my name, and of course, after all this happened, I moved house pretty much immediately. I worked as a babysitter during my college years, just to make some extra money without having to have a set work schedule. For the most part, I took care of this one family's 4-year-old boy, a couple of times a week usually. As the parents would often have dinner events for work and have to leave him home alone. The boy was quiet, but I appreciated that because it made him very easy to watch over. He didn't really want to do much beside watch TV with me and play with his toys. He seemed to like me a lot, actually. This was my 6th time watching after him. I got to the house just before his parents left, and they explained to me they would be back home at around 11 p.m. I needed to make sure he was in bed by 9. The first few hours went as usual. I watched TV with him and made him a small frozen pizza. After finishing his food, he told me he had to use the bathroom and left for a few minutes. When he returned, he asked me about the weird shuffling noises coming from the basement. Of course, I was confused. I immediately turned off the TV. Sure enough, as soon as the TV went quiet, I could clearly hear something moving around down there. It was very faint, though. I couldn't tell what it was. Seeing the boy was very clearly scared now, though. I assured him everything would be okay, and it was probably just a small animal that had gotten in somehow. I told him to wait upstairs while I went down to see what this was. By this point, the shuffling had already stopped. I had never been in the basement of their house before, as it was unfinished and there was never any reason to go down there. I was definitely being cautious as I opened the door and turned on the light by the stairs. I began to walk down quietly and turned on the light at the bottom of the stairs as well, which lit up the whole room. It was a pretty big space, mostly filled up with various storage boxes. I walked around checking behind a few boxes, but after not seeing or hearing anything else, I went back upstairs. The boy was waiting for me on the couch and shot up when he saw me. I told him that everything was fine and nothing was down there. I gave him a big hug to help him feel better too. After a few minutes, we had already forgotten about the whole thing. A couple hours later, it was starting to get closer to 9 o'clock. I started to get him ready for bed. We went upstairs to his room and I made sure he was all ready. I then said goodnight and went back downstairs. I'd sat down on the couch for probably 30 to 40 minutes, just scrolling through my phone, when I began to hear the shuffling from the basement once more. This time, though, it was a lot louder. My heart stopped for a second as I listened. Then I heard the bedroom door open upstairs. The boy called out my name. I told him to stay where he was and to not come down no matter what. I got up and made my way to the basement door. At this point, I was pretty terrified as well. I pulled out my phone and had it ready to call 911 as I opened the door. The shuffling sounded like it was close to the bottom of the stairs now. I reached over and flipped the lights on. Immediately, I slammed the door shut. I ran upstairs to grab the boy, then ran out the front door and called 911. I stood across the street from the house, looking at the windows as I waited for the cops to arrive. I also called the parents to let them know what happened, to come home as soon as they could. When the police arrived, I explained to them what I'd seen. As I turned on those lights by the stairs, I'd seen a half-naked man crouching down by the bottom while searching through a storage box. They carefully searched the home and found clear evidence of someone having lived in the basement recently. There were piles of trash shoved in various boxes, but they couldn't find the actual person. When the parents arrived, they thanked me for calling them and talked to the police about the situation. About an hour later, I was able to go home as they'd secured the house now. They filed the reports as well. I spent the next few days really shaken up and being pretty damn paranoid for a couple of weeks after. I kept in touch with the parents to see if there were any updates on the man, but nothing ever came up. Eventually, we lost touch, as I no longer wanted to babysit anymore. I think the most terrifying thing about it was that the man never got caught. He could be living in someone else's basement right now without them ever knowing. I'm a 20-year-old woman located in the United States. I want to share this story because it was so odd, and it's been on my mind for a while. My memory is a little bit hazy, so some minor details might not be 100%. The story starts at the beginning of 2021, when Minecraft Twitch streamers and YouTubers were extremely popular because of the COVID lockdown. I've always loved making videos on YouTube. Having a small fan base though, I had stopped before 2020. I wanted to get back into video content making because it's something I found really fun and enjoyable, especially since I could make a lot of new friends. To me, it was the perfect hobby. I started streaming on Twitch around springtime in 2021. Of course, I wanted to stream Minecraft content, usually on the server Hypixel. I played a lot of mini-games and all that stuff. I met this guy who we'll call R. I don't exactly remember the circumstances of how we met. I think it was in the game Valorant, maybe? He was also a small-time streamer and became a person who would play and stream alongside me a couple of nights a week. R seemed like a very chill guy, and there were no red flags at all, it seemed. He was super nice to have around. Unfortunately, what happens to many streamers then happened to me as well. I got real busy around the end of May and beginning of June, so I had to stop streaming to focus on work, my life, and responsibilities. R and I lost touch after that. I didn't leave abruptly or anything, but it was a gradual fading apart. Fast forward a year later to the summer of 2022. I just reconnected with a friend named B and her boyfriend Jay, who I also met on Valorant around the same time I started streaming. They had a pretty big following on TikTok, and she was the typical video game e-girl, if you know what I mean. By this point, I had pretty much forgotten all about R, who also was distant acquaintances with these two, I guess. I don't remember how he found out, but eventually he realized I'd started becoming active again. I was notified by B about this because suddenly he started spamming her asking a lot of details about me. It honestly made me terrified because it wasn't like he was chill and wanted to get my info to talk to me again. It was one creepy message right after another, so many of them begging and pleading with B to force me to talk to him. It only got worse from there when she didn't respond to his attempts. It was so odd because it was out of nowhere, and he became more obsessive day by day. Things got much worse within 24 hours, in fact. I had told B to just ignore or block him. She didn't block him, but decided to tell him to stop. He did, and things were calm for a few hours. We were all playing Valorant together when R started to spam her again with constant messages, begging her to give him my information, my username even. She didn't notice he was spamming until she looked at her Discord. She was super creeped out by the hundreds of messages. Not only was he spamming her, he was even trying to call her over and over again. It felt like he was extremely mentally unstable based on the messages he was leaving. He had sent well over a few hundred DMs, and at least 100 call requests as well. He had begun to DM her things like, "Please, I need her." It made me extremely nervous. It was so odd. It wasn't even like we'd been in a relationship or even super close before. We were just casual friends. Eventually, she blocked him after I implored her a few times to do so. That didn't even end things though. If I can recall correctly, R started to contact Jay too. B got pissed that we weren't taking this more seriously. I guess I should have taken her feelings more into consideration because I was kind of joking around in the game to get my mind off it. She got into a fight with Jay. I wasn't really paying attention anymore. I didn't want to get involved with any of this. They left the call suddenly, and Jay started to blame me. I had no idea what I did wrong. I wanted to ask what was going on and how I could fix the situation, but he blocked me. Because they'd gotten into a fight, Jay was now upset with me. He gave R all of my information, my socials, my Discord, my ID. I started getting spammed by him on everything. He even began to stalk me in real life for a while. I had to shut down all my accounts and block him everywhere. Even then, he made multiple alternate accounts to try and trick and friend request me. He'd pretend to be other people who didn't know me. I was scared for a long time, terrified every time a new request would pop up. I was scared he would one day find out where I lived. I'm glad I always used an alias online. Otherwise, he may have been able to use my information to find out more exact details about my address. I didn't ever tell him off or give him any attention, so eventually he started to lose interest in trying to contact me. He really should have stopped when B told him I didn't want to speak with him because of how he was acting like an obsessive stalker. I don't think he could have cared any less about that though. Stalkers never do. I didn't tell anyone about this because I didn't want it to escalate further. I'm glad I didn't interact with him or try to tell him off myself because I imagine that would have made him do something far worse. Although this all took place over a short amount of time, it really made me wary of who I share my information with. You always have to be aware of people's true intentions and their mental state, because even the most normal seeming of people can suddenly become extreme and catch you by surprise with their actions. I really hope my story can help anyone who's going through the same things I went through. Please, everyone, always make sure you stay safe online. Sometimes the risk of sharing your information with the people you think are your friends just isn't worth it.